Hi, everybody. Welcome to Celebrity Influence. I'm Mark Harvey. I want to thank all of you anyway for coming out here this evening. Before I get started, though, I think I probably ought to thank a few people anyway for making this possible, because, I mean, it really is an honor that I get to speak here. So, let me start off, first of all, but I'd like to thank the Academy. It's celebrities, right? You know, I gotta play with that a little bit. First, I have to thank my own home university, University of St. Mary. It is with their permission that I was able to teach here at Johnson County Community College. It's been a real honor to be here, part of this faculty teaching these classes, and so it's great that they were able to do it. I also have to thank my friends over in the History and Political Science Department, Liker, got Brian Wright back there who got me into the program. Kai is over there who has supported my research as well. So thank you to all of them for making me feel very much at home and very, very happy here to be part of all this. I got to thank Susan McSpadden for taking the awesome pictures to try to promote this. She's quite the artist. Got to thank Beryl, of course. She has arranged a lot of these logistics and really made this thing come alive. And finally, you know, I've got to thank some people. I don't even know who they are, the people who were on the committee that decided that I ought to be one of these scholars and get to stand in front of you and give this speech. So anyway, I'm going to thank all of these people. It's just really, it is really an honor to be here. Let's go back to, there's this thing. There's a tweet from Mr. Trump. This guy, tiny-brained Mark Harvey, thinks he can compete for ratings with me on the night of the State of the Union. Middle Marco's ratings will tank. His ratings are going down the tubes. Stat. That's the best I can do. It's a little bit like half New York Jersey gangster or something like that. I don't quite have it down yet. But to that, now of course this is fake tweet. Gotta tell the truth, right? But to that, I will have to say, this is the largest audience ever to witness a JCCC presentation, period. Both in person and around the globe. I have a massive amount of people here. We have a crowd. Look over that sea of people. And I say to myself, wow. And I've seen crowds before, big crowds. That is some crowd.
All right. Always fun to poke a little fun at our president. Well, let me give you an idea of what it is what we'd like to talk about tonight. We'll be talking a little bit about Mr. Trump as the evening goes on, for better or worse. I hope that's all okay. He's a former celebrity, so certainly part of that. We'll be talking about other things too. But sort of my plan for the evening is start off by talking about the topic and research question. Talk a little bit about the rise of celebrity politics. We'll be comparing politician and celebrity power. And then we'll get a little bit into the studies, the results, and so on, the things that I actually did in order to try to make these arguments, the actual research, and kind of end with this sort of question and discussion like, is this what we've come to? Is this the new normal? So we'll kind of get into that. So I just want to start off telling you a little bit about where my inspiration for this book originally came from. I was a graduate student, and I had three big interests anyway throughout my life. To start off with, interest in politics. I was a kid that ran around the schoolyard and stuff like that, asked people like, if you could vote, who would you have voted for and stuff like that. Little tallies. I'm a totally nerd, dork sort of guy. Big surprise, I'm a professor now. So that was with me in my whole life. After college, I went and I owned a small business for several years. I got into international business consulting, and so, I did technical marketing consulting, and that sort of thing sort of informed the sort of marketing and media side of some of what I was doing. And finally, I've been a musician / singer-songwriter for as long as I can remember. I even carry on, hey, there's my shameless promo for the band, right? I mean, I still do this stuff, and I do it because I love it. Right? But for a while, it was hard for me to sort of like think, wow, maybe I can hit a lot of this stuff all at once. And so I had a dream. I know odd things happen in dreams. I had a dream while I was in graduate school that I was at George Harrison's Concert for Bangladesh. Those of you who are not familiar with it, is a 1971 concert. It is the first major event where celebrities got together in order to raise money for a cause, a sort of first big benefit concert. And in my mind, in my dream, I was watching this thing, and all of a sudden it all came together. It's like, hey, they're doing this for a political cause. Does it really matter whether or not these people are doing this stuff? Does it make any kind of change? What's the deal here? I'm curious about this. And so I woke up in the morning, I'm like, hey, I'm going to have to go tell my graduate advisors, my professors and stuff about this awesome idea that I had, right? So I was sitting here thinking, hey, just look, these are some people from the Grammys the other night. This stuff is around all the time. Seems like a big deal. So how do you think my professors respond to this idea? We hear about celebrities' opinions all the time. Does it matter? Does it not matter? I thought it was a pretty good question. Well, the answer that I got from my professors came a little bit like this. Okay, now, this is Larry Sabato. He's a very famous political scientist, much more famous than I am, or certainly any of the professors who taught me. This is a really brilliant, smart political science guy. And this is what he said in 2004 on the subject. My take on celebrity endorsements is that the only weak minds they can sway are, fortunately, not registered voters, or they don't show up at the polls. Very few Americans are empty vessels into which celebrities or the media can pour opinions. Celebrities don't sway any voters with substantial gray matter. I mean, who would vote for someone because Ben Affleck is for them? They'd have to be a blithering idiot. Generally, the blithering idiots are in the movie theaters on election day. Celebrities, most of them couldn't get their spouses to endorse their choice. This is of great fascination to readers of Variety and not to any real people. Thank goodness. So that was kind of the sentiment that I got from some people. And the other sentiment that I got basically is like, well, of course, I mean, you put a celebrity next to a car, you're going to sell a car. You put a celebrity next to a candidate, yeah, you're going to sell a candidate, I mean, you're not telling me anything I don't already know. Intuitively, whatever, it seems to make sense. So I was fighting an uphill battle to get any traction on this for a long, long time. And the thing is that Sabato's not crazy for making this argument. I mean, the political science literature, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but there are a couple of major approaches to questions that have to do with, voting, public opinion, the media, and things like that. One presumes that people are intelligent decision makers. It's a rational choice model, and Sabato's arguing from a rational choice perspective that, when people make choices, they do so, they weigh things out, they think carefully about them, and, then they make things based more or less on the facts. Right? The other approach, which is also very common but completely different, is that people are maybe easily manipulated and make decisions based on simplistic or emotional reasons. That's sort of a more psychological theory. In other words, I like Ben Affleck. It's Batman. I'm going to listen to it. I like Batman, that's the kind of thing. So I may be more influenced by things I like, people I like. Music I like, stuff that's around me in my environment. My identity affects who I am, my social groups. It's not necessarily just this sort of like cost-benefit analysis sort of thing. It has a lot to do with how all this stuff affects the way that I'm processing information in my brain, right? So that's more or less the other approach. Now, I will also say that historically speaking, Sabato is not crazy either, okay? If you were to go back to the early 1970s, where these top two pictures were taken, you'd say, I don't know exactly how much difference celebrities make either. On the left, you see a picture of John Lennon and Yoko Ono in the middle. They are standing with Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who were 60s radicals. They actually lived with these guys for several years in New York, and they concocted a plan, and the plan was that they were going to stop President Nixon from being reelected in 1972. And they were going to put on a series of concerts in order to try to stop that from happening. Now, ultimately, what happened is that Nixon got wind of it, sent the FBI in to spy on John Lennon, denied him the opportunity to get a green card until about the government stopped until about 1975, I think, or something like that, effectively forcing them to focus on the question of his legal residency in the United States, as opposed to getting involved in activism. Sounds somehow familiar, modern days, whatever. But yeah, so Nixon used the full force of the state to stop this stuff from happening, okay? Now, of course, there's another celebrity over here that was a little bit more friendly to Nixon. Those of you who don't recognize him, this was the king of rock and roll, baby. It was Elvis Presley himself. And the king wrote a letter to Mr. Nixon and wanted to meet him. Basically said that he was very, very concerned about the Beatles and the terrible influence they were on our youth and our culture. He was concerned about drug culture and crime and all sorts of stuff, and somehow finagled his way into a meeting with President Nixon to try to lobby in order to try to deal with some of these issues and let his opinion be known. Now, of course, in retrospect, it's very likely that the main reason he wanted that meeting was to get himself a badge, because he collected them. And also thought that by having a federal, he asked actually for a federal, an FBI or federal marshal badge or something like that, because he thought that would allow him to carry his firearms wherever he wanted to, right? So I mean, there was that too, but he also was concerned about this other stuff too, right? So of course, upon meeting Nixon, or upon meeting Elvis Presley, they have this lovely promo shot done up here and released to the media to show everybody how much the celebrity loves Richard Nixon, right? Okay, I'm just kidding. Actually, this picture was taken and was kept classified until the late 1980s. It wasn't released, I think, by the Smithsonian or something like that until that time. Sort of harmless, just a picture of Nixon and the king and so on. But anyway, so it came out much, much later than that. And the argument at the time is that Elvis Presley basically said, I'm willing to go undercover for you to the counterculture. He wanted to be, like I said, he was taking this stuff sort of seriously. But Nixon also was like, oh, that's fine, just, don't make a big deal out of it or anything like that, So Nixon was honestly worried about what it would look like if he was taking advice from the king of rock and roll. Makes sense, right? I mean, this is very rational. The government's going to crush dissenters. They're going to subvert whoever's on their side, or they're going to say, hey, if it makes me look stupid, I'm just not going to let people pay any attention to it, right? And even I was a skeptic on this, right? I put up a picture here of Bono because he was up there in 1989 or something like that, talking about all of the suffering people in Northern Ireland and stuff. And he could do a great sermon if you've ever seen him do his thing. And it's very emotional, it's great. But I watched him, I like you too, and I'm like, man, I don't buy it. It's just some guy giving his opinion, I'm not going to change my mind here. Yet, here we are many years later, and here he is with the President of the United States lobbying on behalf of debt relief for developing countries. So I'm sitting here going, this is really weird. There may be something going on here. And so I started seeing these stories. The more research that I did, the more I started discovering some of these stories. For example, you see, and some of these you'll find in the book as well, like Angelina Jolie made a trip basically on behalf of an activist to appear at a Congolese refugee camp. And essentially they took a bunch of pictures, put the pictures in a museum in Washington, D.C., and essentially crashed the website because of the amount of attention that she was able to generate. Right down here, we see an early example of a celebrity being involved. This is Harry Chapin. Harry Chapin was the guy who sang Cats in the Cradle, if you're familiar with that song anyway. Fairly big celebrity in the 1970s. Actually got involved in lobbying people to send food aid to people in Africa. Ended up being on the President's Commission on Hunger and drew attention to this issue that most people weren't paying attention to at all. He died in, I think, 1980, 81 or something like that, car crash. But it's his organization that eventually sort of became the building blocks for what became Live Aid and many other, the infrastructure of celebrities being able to raise money for stuff. Over here you see a picture of Bob Marley, and on either side of him are two prominent officials from opposing sides in a political dispute in 1976 in Jamaica. That it was so bad that there were gangs that represented opposite sides of the political spectrum. They were killing each other in the street. It was virtual civil war. Marley was able to get these two guys together and shake hands and declare a truce at a concert. And then, of course, you've got Bush and Bono. And I want to take this opportunity just to read a little bit from the book, because I think it really illustrates sort of the question better than anything I can imagine. This is Bono speaking to start off with. George Bush is a comedian. I walk down the corridor. He comes out, stands to attention. Here's the president. What do you want us to do this time, Bono? This is Bono, lead singer of the rock group U2, talking about a private exchange with President George W. Bush at the 2005 G8 summit in Glen Eagle, Scotland. According to Bono, the president humorously stood at attention as if he were at the beck and call of the rock star. At the G8 summit, Bono had a free access backstage pass, which allowed him to lobby President Bush and other world leaders to sign a communique pledging $50 billion of debt relief to some of the poorest countries in the world. And I come around and ask the question, what is a rock star doing at the gathering of the world's most powerful political leaders, and why should anyone listen to him? I thought that was an interesting question. So that was the question that I kind of started off with. You know, don't these politicians have anything better to do than hanging out with celebrities? Why are they paying attention? Why are they spending all this time doing this stuff? Right? But then something else happened in 2016, which changed things a little bit too. And it was funny, this book was actually supposed to come out a little bit earlier, but by the time they'd accepted the book, it was right when Trump got the nomination to become president. They're like, you want to wait a little bit on this, sort of see how this whole Donald Trump thing turns out? And so I waited, I did more research, and I added to it also. So another interesting question here is, how do we end up with basically a celebrity president? Now, there's a lot more research out there that talks about celebrities who lobby on behalf of candidates. I don't go into that so much, but I do sort of go into the media phenomena that might have caused him to essentially become propelled to the presidency. So, what I did is I started off by documenting kind of the rise of celebrity politics, and I'm not going to go into that into a lot of detail at the moment. Like I said, you can check it out in the book, and I talk quite a bit about it. But we've come a long way. There was a time where Frank Sinatra was advocating for Franklin Roosevelt, and like Lennon, like Elvis Presley, you know, not taken very seriously by other politicians. He was called a mere crooner. You shouldn't pay attention to him because he's just a singer, right? And we still see echoes of that nowadays. Like you see here, Colin Kaepernick and the whole business about people taking a knee on the field. Well, they're just football players. They're just entertainers. What do they know, right? On the other hand, all it takes is a powerful speech at an awards ceremony, and now we got a presidential candidate. Another presidential candidate that has about the same amount of experience in politics as Donald Trump did. I know you all probably like Oprah and stuff like that. Hey, maybe she'd be a better president than Trump. I'm just saying that it's interesting how things have changed, right? So the question is, how has it changed? So I start off with this question. This is a question I ask for my students all the time, and you know, I'm not going to ask for you to come up with the answers, but use your brain a little bit, see what the answers are, what you think the answer might be to the question. I always ask them, what is the purpose of a media organization? And I get all sorts of great answers. Like, oh, it's to tell people the news and explain things to people, and they're here to be a check against the government. And sure, it is all of those things. That is all very good. These are great answers, wonderful, right? But it's also important to remember that the purpose of a media organization is to make money, okay? Now, you could argue that that's more or less important over time, but I think that you really cannot forget the fact that this is a media-driven organization relies on advertisements in order to make their money. They have to stay afloat, or else they can't deliver the news. They can't deliver the truth or whatever version of it that they like. So advertisers are sensitive, I should say media organizations are sensitive to advertisers and audiences. They're the source of revenue. Most research suggests that there is a bias in media, but it's not necessarily a liberal bias, as you often hear. But the bias tends to be a lot of times toward advertising, but even more than that, toward demographics. That is, that the Kansas City Star is going to be leaning in a direction that its readership is leaning. Fox News is going to be leaning in a direction where its audience is. And so part of that is to generate interest, to generate enthusiasm, and certainly to generate revenue for advertisers. Technology is key to a lot of these changes that have occurred too. It's increased the power of the business side of the organization. In part because of the way that things have changed in terms of the emphasis of image, right? You go sort of like this key debate between Nixon and Kennedy, and how all of a sudden it matters what somebody looks like. You know, somebody said at a presentation the other day that, you know, Abraham Lincoln was probably the first president that people actually knew kind of what he looked like, had a really clear sense of what that was. And I'm not sure that's absolutely virtually the case, but very likely so, certainly somewhere around that time period. And by the time you got to the 1960s, TVs were in everybody's homes, and it affected the way people were ingesting politics. Likewise, we have revolutions in terms of cable news. We have a 24-hour news cycle. Now we have the internet, right? There's a constant barrage of information. And these media organizations need more and more and more and more stuff to fill that time, right? And so what are you going to fill that time with? Well, I mean, if it were my choice, we'd be filling it with a lot more local news stuff, where I'd actually be able to turn on the TV, find out what's happening at the city council, find out what's happening in my state government, find out what's happening at the Board of County Commissioners. But that is boring, right? They are going to be much more interested in seeing pictures of celebrities or salacious stuff. You know, there's an activist named Paul Watson who was with Greenpeace, who argued to get attention you need sex scandal, violence, and celebrity. This was in the early 80s that he argued this, and he actually is the guy, while trying to advocate on behalf of the Arctic wolves, who were sort of this endangered species, got Bo Derek involved as an advocate for his cause. And media people at the time, keep in mind this is the early 80s, they're like, why are you getting Bo Derek involved? What does she know about Arctic wolves? And he's like, you all showed up, didn't you? You know? And that's part of it, right? And so this is really, I think, illustrates how probably things have changed, or at least intensified in terms of that, right? And this quote, I love this quote from Donald Trump, because I think this is an interesting thing. You ought to think about this, right? It's a real quote, not fake news, right? Another reason that I'm going to win another 4 years is because newspapers, television, and all forms of media will tank if I'm not there, because without me, their ratings are going down the tubes. So they basically have to let me win. And eventually, probably 6 months before the election, they'll be loving me because they're saying, please, please, don't lose Donald Trump. Okay? Is he right? Is he right? The thing is, most of you are like, you know, here's the thing, I love my country more than I love a good joke, right? The media and comedy, they benefit a lot from Donald Trump too. Probably they don't want him to be president again. A lot of them don't, because there's been a lot of criticism of the media. Fair enough, right? But I have a feeling most of you don't want Donald Trump to be right about this. You want Sabato to be right. You want people to think rationally about this. You want people not to listen to the Batman. You want people to think with their heads and do cost-benefit analysis and stuff like that. But Donald Trump is probably right, that most people are not thinking that way, and these media organizations, they're consciously doing this. This is a quote from Jeff Zucker, okay? Jeff Zucker is the head of CNN. Before that, he was the head of NBC. He was the guy who was responsible for bringing The Apprentice to people across the country. He was basically firmly in the Trump camp, at least until he came over to CNN and they started reporting on the Donald, and the Donald wasn't so happy about it, as you know, CNN, fake news, right? But this is what Zucker says, reflecting upon the coverage in the 2016 election. If we made any mistake last year, it's that we probably did put too many of his campaign rallies in those early months and let them run. Listen, because you never knew what he would say, there was an attraction to put those on the air, right? Trump delivered. He was a publicity magnet. Trump delivered on PR. He delivered on big ratings. And so Zucker puts him on there. It worked at NBC. It worked on CNN. And it's going to work again in another few years. And that's, you know, like I said, Oprah gives a speech and suddenly, you know, that's where we're at. So, like I said, the first thing basically that caused a change, I would argue, was a change in technology and media and the business side and all that sort of stuff. The other thing that changed is more on the celebrity side. There's been an increase in celebrity autonomy, okay? Traditionally speaking, if you're looking at the history of entertainment in the United States, most of our entertainers were connected to a contract that was attached to a studio, at least for a long, long time. There were studio-level contracts. Nowadays, you know, you might sign somebody for a movie, right? Especially, particularly among film stars. Right? Back then, they'd be signed to a film studio. And in those contracts, there were these things called morality clauses, which suggested that if anybody was publicly seen doing something that was not okay, then the studio could drop them. And so that put them in a position where a lot of them were afraid to express themselves in any sort of political way. That changed largely in the 1960s, I would argue, really due to the success of a little band called the Beatles. They were extremely financially successful upon reaching America. Basically, the modern version of going viral. I mean, it's like they were seen sort of accidentally on the evening news with Walter Cronkite, and they were demanding records before Capitol Records could print them. It was crazy. So here they are, extremely wealthy in a short period of time, and they were able to change the rules of the industry. What they started doing and saying things like, Sure, we'll do a concert in the South, but it has to be in front of an integrated audience, right? Otherwise, we're not going. And so, as these celebrities became more autonomous, both creatively and financially, that changed some of the landscape in terms of the places they worked in, the atmosphere that they worked in. So by the late 1960s, you look at rock and folk artists, and they have a lot more freedom of expression in terms of what it is that they're able to do and what they can say and so on. There's still huge problems for movie stars, at least until about late 60s, 1970s, where those contracts start changing quite a bit. Athletes still have challenges with this. You know, they're signed to teams, right? They're not signed to individual games. Those teams don't necessarily have morals contracts. But as you can imagine, somebody acts a certain way on a team, reflects badly on the team. There's a lot of pressure for these athletes not to speak out. There are contracts with Nike, you know, athletic contracts and so on. That stuff could all go down the drain if they say something bad. And so when an athlete nowadays is coming out and saying something, they're taking a little bit more of a financial risk, perhaps, than some are. However, I would also argue that, you know, even though some musicians have gained a great deal of autonomy, there's a lot of them that haven't. Like, if you remember the picture over here of the Dixie Chicks, you know, they went on record in a speech in London. Wasn't even a speech, it was like 8 words or something. We're ashamed that the President of the United States is from Texas. And as a result, it created a huge backlash in which country fans throughout the United States were burning their CDs and symbolically just villainizing them on the radio. And I wouldn't say it didn't destroy their career. I mean, it's still around, they're still doing stuff, but it certainly affected their financial success over a period of time. So the autonomy of celebrities affects their ability to sort of come out and speak. And those that are less autonomous are really taking much more significant risks than you might expect.